The biomedical storage room was as silent as a tomb. The cramped space reeked of antiseptic, the flickering overhead lights stuttering in rhythm with Venus Hart's pounding heartbeat. Her wrist had gone numb beneath Julian Voss's icy grip, a hole just tight enough to leave no marks, but strong enough to remind her exactly who was in control. His pearl gray suit, designer cologne, and polished smile couldn't mask the rot that clung to every breath he took. 3.5 months, Julian murmured, his breath brushing the side of her neck. That's how long you've been pretending I don't exist. Did you really think I'd forget what happened that night? Venus twisted, trying to pull her arm free. A cascade of antiseptic bottles, latex gloves, and test tubes clattered to the floor around them. Chaotic echoes of a nightmare she never dared to name. "Let go of me, Julian," she said, low but steady. "I don't owe you anything. What you did to me was rape." "Iker," Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound like glass cracking. "Rape?" he repeated as if amused. "You're adorable when you play the victim. Did you forget? You got in my car. You drank my wine. You smiled." "Because I was afraid," Venus snapped, tears stinging, but voice taut with rage. "I didn't think you'd..." "Didn't think I'd what?" Julian cut her off, his grip tightening until she gasped. "Do something we both know can't be undone. You clawed at me, Venus. You left moans and scratches on my leather seats. And now you want to play holy?" "You're sick," Venus hissed. Her whole body trembled, but her eyes blazed with fire. "I'm not yours. I'm not your property." Julian chuckled darkly. "Not mine? You're carrying something that belongs to me." He leaned in closer, his whisper scraping her ear. "A baby, Venus. I've noticed. Your body's changing. You may fool your colleagues, but not me." Venus paled, her hand instinctively covering her still flat stomach. "If you touch me again, I swear I'll scream. This time I won't stay silent," she said, voice trembling but firm. "Try," Julian said, releasing her with a smirk, adjusting his cuff like nothing had happened. "But remember this, if you speak, I'll rewrite the story before you even finish your first sentence. You'll be the manipulative tech, the liar, and they'll believe me, because I paid for this building's lights." "No one will believe you," she whispered, though fear clutched her throat. Julian tilted his head, his smile all ice. "A white co-founder and investor versus a black lab tech from South Hill? Tell me, Venus, who do you think they'll side with?" He stepped back, fixed his collar, and walked to the door. When it slammed shut behind him, Venus collapsed to her knees among the scattered supplies. Her stomach ached, not from pain, but from the truth she could no longer deny. Yet even as terror threatened to drown her, something fierce still flickered in her eyes. One day she would speak, and this time she wouldn't speak alone. 2 hours had passed since Venus had collapsed in the supply room, but her breath still hadn't steadied. She moved through her shift like a machine, checking enzyme temperatures, logging cell counts, calibrating centrifuges. But every time her hands brushed against someone, they trembled. On the outside, she looked composed. Inside, she was splitting apart. Her next emergency patient sent whispers rippling through the Institute's halls. Micah Reyes, founder of Reyes Genetics, the biotech startup responsible for the revolutionary diagnostic platform the Institute now used. Venus recognized the name immediately. She'd expected a man surrounded by bodyguards, assistants, ego. But the one they wheeled in was far from that. Shirt bloodied, shoulder dislocated, a long gash across his forehead still bleeding. No symbols of power, just a man, hurt and raw. "He refused the VIP ambulance," another tech whispered. "Said he wanted to be treated like everyone else." Venus leaned down to check his blood pressure. Micah's eyes opened, deep brown and unguarded. But what made her pause was how he looked straight into hers. Not at his wounds, not at the monitors, at her. "What's your name?" His voice was rough but gentle. "Venus," she replied automatically, then quickly corrected. "Technician Hart." "Venus," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Beautiful name. But your eyes, they're telling a different story." The words froze her. No one had ever said that to her. No one had looked past the practiced smile she'd worn like armor for the past 3.5 months. No one had asked. "I'm fine," she whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Micah didn't press. He simply looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached toward the crumpled jacket beside him and pulled out a small business card. "I watched my sister fall apart once," he said softly. "She had no one? Don't let that happen to you." He handed her the card. On the back was a handwritten number. "If you ever need someone to talk to, someone who has no ties to this institute or your past, call me." Venus took it, her hand trembling slightly. "Why?" she asked, barely louder than breath. "Why would you care?" Micah smiled. Blood still trickled from his temple, but his gaze was steady. "Because I know that look," he said gently, "and I don't believe anyone should carry that kind of pain alone." 3 days passed. The business card still sat folded in the chest pocket of Venus's white lab coat, its edges softening from the constant touch of her fingers. She hadn't called. She only reached for it. Like as long as it stayed there, the exit still existed, even if she wasn't ready to walk through it. On the third night, the nightmare returned. The sharp scent of antiseptic, the sound of a door slamming shut, cold breath whispering at her ear. Venus bolted upright, drenched in sweat, her fingers gripping the edge of the bed. 15 weeks. Her body was changing. Denial was no longer an option. 9:12 p.m. She picked up her phone and stared at the handwritten number on the back of the card. Her thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating. Then she pressed call. 3 rings. Then his voice. Warm, familiar, steady. "Venus?" Micah recognized her instantly. "I hoped it was you." "It is," she croaked. I don't know where to start." "You don't have to start in order," he said gently. "We have time." They met at a small cafe a few blocks from the institute, quiet enough for truth, but not so empty that it echoed with loneliness. When Venus walked in, Micah was already there. Simple shirt, no watch, no laptop, just a cup of tea and a patient silence. "Why am I here?" Venus asked as she sat down, her eyes guarded. "I haven't trusted anyone in 4 months." "Maybe because some part of you still wants to," Micah replied, his voice like background music, soft, steady. "And maybe because no one's ever stopped long enough to ask." She looked at him, her eyes a mirror of 1,000 fractures. Then for the first time since that night, she let the truth out with breath. "I was raped by someone rich, powerful, and I'm pregnant with his child." She didn't cry. There were no tears, only heavy breathing between 2 hearts beating out of rhythm. Micah didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was iron, not with anger, but resolve. "Then we rebuild from the rubble. And I won't let you do it alone." Venus had never sat in a law office before, not in her dreams, and certainly not in any version of her life plan. Yet here she was, surrounded by pale gray walls and the faint scent of old paper, one hand gently resting over her stomach, where a quiet heartbeat pulsed, reminding her she was no longer alone. Micah sat beside her, silent, not touching, not pushing, just present, like a pillar in the middle of a flood, steady and unshakable. Then the door opened. Camille Durant stepped in, not the cold, theatrical courtroom lawyer you see in TV dramas, but a woman whose eyes carried the full weight of truth. She didn't need to prove she was sharp. She was sharp. "Venus," Camille began, her voice calm and precise. "I know you didn't come here because this is easy. You owe me no explanations, but if you're ready to fight, I won't let you do it alone." Venus clasped her hands in her lap. Her fingers were freezing from fear, but trembling with something else. Maybe hope. "I was raped," she said. Each word dropped into the room like lead. "And I'm pregnant. The man who did it is Julian Voss." Camille didn't blink. "I suspected as much," she nodded. "He's had 2 prior accusations, both sealed with NDAs. Neither made it to court." Venus swallowed. "He said he'd ruin me, take my job, my name, and the baby. Then we won't give him the chance," Camille replied, her voice firm. "We'll file an emergency protective order, and we'll gather evidence, camera footage, texts, witness statements. I want him exposed. This time, no more silence." She looked Venus directly in the eye. "But I need to know. Are you ready?" Before Venus could answer, Micah spoke. His voice was soft, but iron strong. "If needed, I'm willing to be the child's legal father. I'll adopt the baby." The room fell silent. Even Camille paused for a beat. Then her gaze softened. Not in sentiment, but in recognition. Venus didn't know what to feel. Her chest tightened, not from panic, but from something deeper. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever wanted this child, except her. "You know, I haven't even decided if I'll keep it, right?" she whispered. Micah turned to her, gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to decide for you, but if you choose to, then you won't do it alone." A single tear slipped from Venus's eye, landing silently on her lips. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. "Okay," she whispered, "I'll fight, not just for me, for my baby, for what comes next." Camille nodded once, and then she smiled, not gently, but like a warrior ready for war. Venus had hoped that after the emergency protective order, she could finally breathe. A week passed. No messages, no footsteps at her back, no shadows lurking near the staff elevator. She dared to believe the darkness had retreated. But Julian Voss was not the kind of man who disappeared quietly. He was the kind who spread fear like mold, silently but with roots that reached deep. On Monday afternoon, Venus found a bouquet of white roses lying in front of her locker. No card, no name, just a single red satin ribbon tied in a loop, the exact shape of the bruise he'd once left around her wrist 3 months ago. She didn't need a name to know exactly who it came from. 2 days later, the whispers began. Near the break room, a coworker murmured quietly, "I heard she used to be close with one of the big donors, the guy who got us that gene analysis system." Venus didn't respond, but something inside her cracked. Then came the email. No sender, no subject line, just one sentence. "Silence is the wiser choice. That baby's not worth everything you'll lose." She ran to the bathroom the moment she finished reading, dry heaving, her hands trembling like her bones had turned to glass. She pressed her forehead to the mirror, trying to breathe. Even the air felt hostile. That night, Micah came to pick her up. He found her curled up on the back steps of the institute, still in her lab coat, hair tangled, arms wrapped protectively around her belly despite the warm air. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat beside her. "He started again," Venus whispered, eyes fixed on the pavement. "Not directly, but he's everywhere." Micah nodded slowly. "I know. I've seen it too." Venus wrapped her arms tighter around her stomach. "I'm tired, Micah. Tired of pretending I'm not afraid. Tired of walking like I'm not being hunted. I hate always having to look over my shoulder." "You don't have to pretend with me," Micah said gently. "I don't want you to be strong because you have to. I want you to be soft, if that's who you really are." She turned to him, eyes glassy but unbroken. "What if I told you that sometimes I just want to disappear from it all?" "I'd think you're human," Micah said, placing a soft hand over hers. And if you need to disappear, then let me go with you." A silence settled between them. No one checked the time. Only the sound of a distant ambulance and the heartbeat of someone relearning how to trust. "We need to step up your protection," Micah said at last. "I'm hiring full-time security. No elevators alone. No late-night shifts without backup. I'll handle everything." "You don't have to do that," Venus murmured. "It's not because I have to. It's because I want to," he answered firmly. She let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. "Okay," she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "Just for a little while." "For as long as it takes," Micah said, eyes fixed toward the light. "Until you don't have to walk through this storm alone." It had been 4 weeks since that night Venus curled up on the back steps of the Institute, arms wrapped around her belly like an empty shell, and Micah simply sat beside her without a single word. From that moment on, without grand declarations, he quietly began changing the world around her. Micah hired personal security for her, rearranged her shifts, drove her to and from work every day. He never asked, "Are you okay?" But every quiet gesture said clearly, "I'm here." Not out of duty, but because his heart hadn't left hers for a single second since the night she called. Venus began to breathe easier, not because Julian had disappeared, but because for the first time, fear didn't sit alone in the dark. One Saturday afternoon, Micah drove her out of the city. His old car rumbled down back roads until they reached a hilltop where beams of wood rose from the ground, like an unfinished dream. "I planned to build a home here," Micah said, gently holding her hand, "long before I met you. But now, this place has a real reason to exist." Venus stepped into the skeletal frame of the house. Afternoon sunlight filtered through exposed rafters, casting long shadows on unpainted walls. In the front, a small room facing the forest had been marked on the blueprint. Nursery. She walked toward it, resting her hand on her belly, as if the little life inside her was listening too. "You know," she whispered, "I haven't imagined a place I could call home in a very long time." Micah stood behind her, his voice low and sure. "You've lost so much, and still, you protect the most fragile thing in your world. I don't love you because you needed saving. I love you because you never stopped loving, even when you were afraid." Venus turned to him, eyes full but tears not yet fallen. Micah stepped closer, then knelt on the dusty concrete floor. "If you'll let me," he said, "I want to be the one who protects you and this baby, officially, not because you need it, but because you deserve it." From his pocket, he pulled a small ring. Simple, not showy, but in that moment, it was the most honest thing in the world. "Venus Hart, will you marry me?" Venus didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, knelt with him, and wrapped her arms tightly around him, like it was both the first time and forever. "I don't need to be rescued," she whispered near his ear, "but I need to be loved, and I choose you. I never thought I'd trust again, but with you, I remember who I used to be." Venus knew this day would come, but her hands still trembled when she opened the court envelope. Voss, Julian V. Hart, Venus, petition for DNA testing and paternal rights. He had actually done it, not content with violating her, not satisfied with threatening her. Now he wanted to claim the baby, the only thing anchoring her to hope. Micah sat beside her at the small kitchen table, his eyes locked on the words. He wasn't angry. He was focused, steady, like someone quietly preparing for a storm. "I'm not surprised," he said softly. "When power starts to slip, it lashes out at whatever it thinks it owns." Venus swallowed hard. He doesn't want the baby. He wants control. He wants to use the child to chain me down forever. "And I won't let that happen," Micah replied. Camille Durant wasn't surprised either. She set the documents on the table and said bluntly, "We strike first. This time we bring the truth into the light." She reached out to two of Julian's former NDA-covered accusers. One declined, too scared, too tired. But the other, Emily Caldwell, now living in Maine, agreed after a long, quiet phone call. "I stayed silent once out of fear," Emily said, "but I won't let him take another child as a trophy." The court date arrived. Venus entered the courtroom with Micah holding her hand, never letting go. Her palms were ice cold, but his grip was solid, grounding her. Across the aisle sat Julian, polished as ever, tailored suit, silk tie, practiced smile. He nodded to the judge as though he were the wrong party. Camille stood, her tone calm but sharp as a blade. She submitted evidence, surveillance footage, scattered text messages, quiet proof with undeniable weight. Then she presented the marriage certificate of Venus and Micah, along with the formal adoption filing. "This child," Camille said clearly, "already has a father, not by blood, but by choice and by love. Two things Mr. Voss has never truly understood." Then Emily took the stand. The room held its breath as she spoke, about how Julian once silenced her, and how that silence had haunted her for over a decade. Julian didn't speak, but his eyes burned with fury, as if a woman telling the truth was his greatest offense. Venus sat beside Micah, his hand over hers. As Emily finished her story, a tear slipped down Venus's cheek. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was because, for the first time, she wasn't speaking alone. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours, but for Venus, each minute felt like being dragged back into that night. Cold, numb, and alone. But today, she wasn't alone. When Camille finished her statement, the courtroom fell still. The judge looked down, flipping slowly through the files. Evidence, sworn testimonies, signed certificates. He didn't ask many questions. He just watched. Finally, he looked up. His voice was clear, steady, and left no room for argument. Based on the evidence presented, the witness testimonies, and the current marital status of Ms. Hart, the court hereby denies Mr. Julian Voss's petition for DNA testing and parental rights. No one in the room exhaled right away. It was only when the judge continued, his tone resolute like a closing door. "Mr. Micah Reyes is recognized as the legal father of the unborn child. Full custodial rights are granted to the married couple. The court considers this a legally protected family unit, and no further motions from the plaintiff will be reviewed." Julian didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched, knuckles bone white on the armrest. Venus exhaled, a breath she hadn't fully released in months. Her hand reached for Micah's. He took it, just as he always had. "I can't believe this really happened," she whispered. "I can," Micah replied, eyes still fixed across the room. "And I believe this is only the beginning." Less than a week after the court dismissed his petition, Julian Voss took himself to an even deeper fall. On a gray Tuesday night, a court clerk who had handled documentation from Venus's case quietly walked into the FBI field office. No lawyer, no escort, just a single statement. "I couldn't let a child grow up in the hands of someone like him." She handed over a USB drive. On it, Julian's voice, cold and calm as ever. "Everyone has a price. I just need the right nod at the right time." He was arrested that same night for attempting to bribe a federal court official, but it was only the beginning. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, and like a spiderweb unraveling, a 10-year network of abuse and cover-ups came into view. Fake charitable foundations used for laundering funds. Buried sexual misconduct reports hidden beneath airtight NDAs. Donations offered to universities and medical institutions in exchange for silence. Women who had been silenced for a decade, once convinced no one would believe them, began to step forward. Their stories echoed eerily, seduced, threatened, silenced, and discarded, left to carry shame while he built fame. Julian Voss, once hailed as a philanthropic visionary and man of science, now stood at the center of a rotting system, propped up by reputation, shielded by money, and sustained by the fear of others. For Venus, justice would never erase the past. But for the first time, the system that once protected him was crumbling. Right before her eyes and under the weight of truth. 6 weeks after Julian's arrest, Venus went into labor on a morning wrapped in soft rain. Micah drove through it with shaky hands, more from hope than fear, the kind of trembling that only comes from those who've lost everything and are now being handed something they never dared to dream of. The birth wasn't easy. There was sweat, tears, and waves of pain that felt unending. But at 3:18 a.m., under dim hospital lights and the steady beeping of heart monitors, a cry broke the silence. Not loud, not frantic, but just enough to stop the world for a moment. Aurora Hart Reyes, 7 pounds 2 ounces, 19 inches, deep brown eyes, hair soft as mist. Venus clutched Micah's hand, exhausted but more awake than she'd ever been. "I made it," she whispered, "and I'm not afraid anymore." Micah leaned down, kissed her forehead, then kissed his daughter's. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The way he looked at the child, calm, grateful, anchored, was a language stronger than anything spoken. 3 days later, the court finalized Micah's status as Aurora's legal father. No objections, no questions, because when they looked at him holding her, there was no DNA test in the world that could explain a love that deep. 3 months after Aurora's birth, the little house on the hill had become a real home. No fancy mansion, no electric gates or private drives, just a warm wooden house with a tin roof, a small kitchen that always smelled like morning tea and slightly burnt toast. Venus no longer startled at unfamiliar sounds. No more nightmares chasing her out of sleep. Rest came easier now, and she woke not out of fear, but to the soft giggles of her baby girl calling for her. Each evening, Venus played the piano in the living room, gentle lullabies for Aurora to fall asleep in her arms. Micah would sit across from them, laptop open, but eyes always drawn to the two people he loved more than anything in the world. Together, they had founded a small organization called Hope Forward, a support platform for survivors of power-based abuse. Venus used her own story not as a scar, but as a bridge. One rainy night, with her head resting on Micah's shoulder, Venus whispered, "Do you think I'm truly healed?" Micah squeezed her hand gently. "Not because you forgot, but because you kept going, even with a heart that once shattered. That's healing." 2 years after Aurora's birth and Julian Voss's arrest, the garden behind the hillside home glowed in soft, golden dusk. Spring had returned. Lavender swayed gently in the breeze, their scent draping the air with calm. On the lush green lawn, a curly-haired toddler took her first wobbly steps, unsteady but determined. "You're doing great, Aurora," Micah called out, arms wide open. Aurora tumbled forward into his arms, her giggles ringing like tiny bells. Venus sat on the porch bench, her hand resting gently on her belly, where another tiny heartbeat was quietly blooming. She was 6 months pregnant, but this time there was no fear, only stillness, only trust. Micah walked over, scooped Aurora into his arms and sat beside his wife. He looked at her with a softness deep enough to quiet any storm. "They're kicking," Venus whispered. "Can you feel it?" Micah placed his hand over her belly, his eyes reflecting the silent peace of a man who once felt lost, but had found his way home. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you," he said softly. "Someone strong enough to make fear retreat." Venus leaned her head on his shoulder. Aurora nestled into his chest like she knew it was the safest place in the world. No more court papers, no more shadows, only the sound of birds returning to their nests, the scent of apple pie from the kitchen, in a home built from everything once thought broken. "I used to think I'd never have a day like this," Venus whispered. "A day I didn't have to fight. A day I didn't have to look over my shoulder. Because you've already won, Micah smiled. Not in court, in your own heart. And beneath the orange-pink sky, 3 hearts, and one quietly growing, sat in silence. Because sometimes peace doesn't come from forgetting, it comes from surviving and choosing love again.